Hi, Joe. At the beginning, would be great if you could explain us what are really digital rights and why do you think that they are really important today?
Well, digital rights are simply human rights, but enforced in a way that means that they actually exist in the online world like they exist in the offline world. So we have freedom of communication, we have privacy, we have freedom of assembly in the offline world. We have constitutional rights, we have international human rights law saying that we have the right to privacy, to freedom of expression and so on. And having those rights in the online environment creates particular challenges that we're not used to. We haven't seen them before. We haven't seen a situation where big companies control our communications. They host our information, they host our messages on Facebook, they find our messages on Google. And we need to think about how do we keep the rights that we have traditionally, that we value traditionally, that our society is based on in the online world, so that we can continue to have successful, effective democracies and free speech.
So does it mean that human rights we developed over last century, during 20th century, do not really have effectiveness in online space?
They have effectiveness, but decreasingly so. It's kind of a strange development. If you look at the internet in 1998, for example, it was a very open, democratic place. There were lots of different places to put your material. There were lots of different ways of speaking to people internationally. And it was a new way of enjoying the traditional human rights that we had. In 2016, things are a little bit different because now there are fewer online companies. It's difficult to imagine having a political campaign that doesn't use Facebook, for example. And Facebook is an international company that works in different jurisdictions. Its rules don't necessarily reflect the laws of the country that you're in. They might be more restrictive, they might be less restrictive. And when you put something on Facebook, you're bound by their terms of service, and you're bound by how they interpret their terms of service. So suddenly, the law isn't what governs how you communicate anymore.
And why is that the problem? Because we heard a lot in the last 15 years, mainly from not so democratic countries, that the content and the freedom of expression online should not be governed by the state, but by the platforms. Well, what's the real problem there?
Well, the problem is the motivation. If you're a democratic state, then you're accountable to the people in your democratic state. If you're an international publicly listed company on the stock exchange, your primary concern is logically your stakeholders, your shareholders. If you act in a way which undermines their profitability, then they're going to act in a logical way. And they're not accountable to you. If they delete your content, you signed up to their terms of service. You said that they can delete your content, and so they will.
But how these companies can take from me rights provided to me by my government and international institutions and conventions?
Well, when you sign up to Facebook, you sign up to their terms of service. You may not read their terms of service. You may not understand their terms of service. I suspect they do not understand their terms of service. However, they know that if there's a problem, they can interpret their terms of service how they like and remove your content if it's a problem for them. And that's how law is replaced by unpredictable terms of service.
So if they have the understanding of terms of service, which is not our understanding of terms of service, why don't we go to our government, to our courts, and try to just get some kind of equal treatment in that situation?
Well, they are private companies, and they can't be forced to keep content online that they find objectionable. Now, if you have 30 different Facebooks that you can choose between, and one of them doesn't like cat photographs or conservatives or socialists, you go to one of the other alternatives, and then you have a way of communicating your message. If there are lots of different platforms, the problem that we face today is, firstly, how do we deal with the fact that there's only one Facebook? Google has a huge market share, particularly in Europe, on search. YouTube is a quasi-monopoly in video. That's a problem for predictability, because we can't moderate our speech based on a guess of how they are going to moderate our speech. And the situation gets worse when you have governments who are worried about real problems like hate speech or child abuse material or whatever, and they don't know how to solve the problem, but they do know they can create a good press release saying, why doesn't Google do more? And why doesn't Facebook do more? And then, rather than governments trying to address the problem of the power of these platforms, governments are finding it to be an attractive short-term solution to give those companies that have too much power more power.
Okay, so as some kind of head of EDRi at the moment, you are advocating for better protection of human rights in digital environment and digital rights in general, mainly in Brussels. So what is your strategy if these private companies are really accountable to their shareholders, how your advocacy strategy can influence their rules and their relation with us as consumers and users of their services?
We try as far as possible to push for terms of service that are understandable, that are reasonable and proportionate. And above all, the problem that we face at the moment is more on the government side, because the challenge we have is that the problem keeps getting worse by short-term positions of governments, with the German government putting pressure on Facebook to do more on hate speech, with the European Commission to adopt, pushing them to adopt a code of conduct on hate speech. We don't quite know what hate speech is. The European Commission itself paid for a study which shows that there is a huge divergence of laws in EU member states outlawing different types of so-called hate speech. And their solution isn't to create a predictable, proportionate law that we can understand and respect. Their approach is to say, well, if only Google and Facebook did more, and Twitter. So the hole that we're in keeps getting deeper. So we need to stop digging. We need to move away from populist, simple answers. No, Google cannot fix the world. Twitter cannot fix the world. We live in a Europe that has a convention on human rights that says that restrictions on our freedom of communication and our privacy need to be effective and proportionate and based on law. We have a digital environment where the measures that are being pushed onto private companies are generally not effective, generally not proportionate, and generally not based on law. It's a revolution led by our governments against our basic fundamental rights.
How do you assess the state of privacy and data protection on internet at this moment?
At this moment, it is quite disastrous. I think it's more than just privacy and data protection. It's also our security as individuals. Who we are as people is being investigated and analyzed in ways that most people, including me until quite recently, don't quite understand.
And what are the main fundamental changes which will be brought by implementation of General Data Protection Regulation?
The General Data Protection Regulation is very ambitious, and it achieves more, or has more on paper, than many people would have thought was possible. It gives greater rights in key areas in relation to the internet, particularly about profiling and automated decision making. And if it's implemented correctly, then it will be a fantastic boost for European citizens and European business that will be able to benefit from a clear structure for protection of personal data, because that will build trust, and trust is hugely important in the online world.
Can you tell us a bit about the process of negotiating and bringing into and voting of GDPR?
It was a very long process. It started in 2010, if I remember correctly. The European Commission made an initial communication explaining what it was trying to do. It then put forward a very big directive. There are over 90 articles. It went to the European Parliament, where it was quite controversial, where everything went horribly wrong for most of the process of the discussion of the Parliament. But then in the end, the Parliament produced its initial position, which was quite strong and quite different from a lot of the discussions that led up to the good outcome. There was then a negotiation with the EU member states, which was very slow, there was a lot of resistance from countries that you would expect there to be resistance from, such as the United Kingdom, resistance from countries that you wouldn't expect resistance from, such as Germany, and it seemed almost impossible for the process to come to a conclusion. The Snowden revelations happened at exactly the right time. It's difficult to tell what happened in the negotiations between the moment before and the moment after, and I can't find any specific link between the revelations and what was being discussed, but things changed and the process moved forward. And then an agreement was reached. It was adopted by the European institutions, and now it's going through a process of implementation in the member states.
Can we expect that citizens will be empowered by adoption and implementation of GDPR, or still civil society organizations and institutions as the watchdogs have to play the leading role?
The rights will only be effective if people demand their implementation. So that is, you have a right of access to information, you have a right of rectification of information, you have a right to object to profiling, and these rights need to be exercised, or they won't be effective. There is an issue with the regulation that there are a lot of optional measures. There are measures that member states may or may not implement, that they can implement in one way or another way. And it's going to be very important to make sure that the member states implement the flexibilities in a way that is beneficial to citizens. And we've produced a very, very long analysis of all of the flexibilities and presented it to the member states in order to facilitate a citizen-friendly implementation.
how do you assess the EU-US relations in respect to data protection, considering that still biggest platforms are coming from the US, and this new regulation will bring big changes to the European market, and the decisions of the European courts? Do you think that GDPR will be fully implemented to US companies? Is it possible, and is it in the line with the foreign relations between EU and US?
Well, is it possible? Yes. Is it inevitable? No. There are lots of barriers between having good international data protection. So we have, for example, the safe harbor ruling, which overturned an existing EU-US data transfer agreement. That there was supposed to be a renegotiation in order to maintain protection. The US refused to negotiate effectively, and the European Union backed down, and we now have a thing called Privacy Shield, which is not very good, and is not very good because Europe didn't have the courage to insist on the US making the necessary reforms. So what's now going to happen is that's going to go back to the European Court again in a year or two. It's going to be overturned again, and then we go through the whole process. So that needs to be solved. We then have trade agreements which are being discussed. TTIP, the Transatlantic Investment Partnership that everyone knows about. The trade and investment agreement called TISA specifically addresses personal data. The discussions are quite disturbing, and we could have a lowering of global standards under this TISA agreement. With leadership, with determination, Europe can play a leading role in defending global citizens' rights. Without that leadership, it can capitulate and allow damage to our privacy and our security.
After Snowden revelations, this trust between the states and citizens was broken, mainly to the United States, but we were also aware that European states were also involved in certain processes. Do we have sufficient information about the state of surveillance in Europe at the moment? And can we expect that we can strengthen the safeguards in this respect?
We certainly don't have enough information, and in particular we don't have enough information to make governments and security services accountable. And this lack of accountability is hugely important because data is power. Data, if somebody knows something about you and you don't know something about them, then they have a degree of power over you. Vast, uncontrolled data collection by unaccountable agencies cooperating internationally that is untransparent is dangerous and a problem for our democracy. How we overturn this is going to be a long and difficult process. We had the European Data Retention Directive that was clearly illegal, but it took 7 years, 8 years for it to be overturned by the courts. Last week, the Advocate General of the Court of Justice of the European Union said that the EU deal with Canada to share air passenger data was unacceptable from a legal perspective. Europe has a far worse deal with the United States on air passenger data. Europe has a far worse deal with Australia on air passenger data. Europe recently adopted a directive on air passenger data, which is worse. so we're making, and all of those now need to be revisited and to be brought in line with the law. So we're making small steps in the right direction, but it's a process that's too slow.
One a little bit different question, but like, can we expect that state regulations and laws can effectively regulate technology? For example, can we expect that GDPR will be possible to implement within the cloud technology, which is quite distributed and very complex from the point how data are stored and used?
Well, you don't regulate technology, you regulate uses of technology. So it's imminently possible to organize. I mean, we can't get into a mindset where we say we have so much technology we can't use technology anymore. Of course, the technology exists to respect fundamental rights principles, data protection principles, privacy principles, if there's a will to do it. You can't say our technology is so good we don't know where our data is anymore. That doesn't make any sense. We control technology. Technology shouldn't control us.
Thanks. Can you just explain in short what is net neutrality and why is it so important for internet users?
Net neutrality is simultaneously very simple and very complex. If you imagine you're a big internet company and you have 5 million users, and you see big internet companies making lots of money, and you say, if they had to pay to get access to my customers, wouldn't that be great? Why shouldn't they pay to get access to my customers? I built the network. So they're making profits talking to my customers over my network, and I'm not getting paid by them. This is terrible, is the basic argument. So the big telecoms companies want to be the gateway between the internet and their customers. And they want the internet. They want you to pay to access the internet, but they want the internet to pay to access you. Now, why is this a bad thing? Well, that's a bad thing because if you're somebody that is launching a new product or launching a new blog or have invented the next big thing on the internet, and you can't access the internet, the people on the internet can't access your service or your blog or your idea because the internet companies have put you in the slow lane because you can't afford to pay them, then you're undermining the openness of the internet. You're undermining the democratic principles of the internet, and you're undermining the incentives to innovate. Today, everyone can communicate with everyone on an equal basis. If tomorrow you launch a service in Europe and you need to pay Deutsche Telekom and France Telecom and British Telecom and Telefonica and Telia and Telecom Serbia, etc., the internet has stopped being the internet. So you make 30 companies quite happy for a few years until the internet becomes a poor place that nobody wants to be anymore. Or you keep the internet open and people keep wanting fast internet connections, and those companies stay happy, and then the rest of society stays happy too.
Thanks. Almost the last question. So practically it's something what we talked at the beginning and now you mentioned. We have more and more platforms which are getting huge networks of people, and these networks and connections between them, relations established through the platform, are becoming the value and the basis for business model of these platforms, regardless of sectors. So then we have like thinkers and speakers saying like that these platforms will regulate the social relations, will regulate the communication, and so on, and also proposing that, for example, lawyers more focus on private regulations, terms of service, and so on of these platforms than legal regulations, because they are not enforceable and there is no power within these companies. So do you believe that there is a point where some platform goes from the private sphere and from this regulatory arena, which is private, into the public, when one platform becomes a public space because of the, let's say, monopoly, because of the concentration and the market share it has? And can we see where is that point where on what platform, beside private regulation, there is also a huge amount of public regulation which should be applicable to them? Was it clear enough?
Yes, it's a ferociously difficult question to answer from a whole range of perspectives. First of all, a company that is that big is going to be a publicly listed international company. So in the same way as you can't require a newspaper, with some exceptions, to run a news story, it's difficult to require a platform to host something that it believes is objectionable for whatever reason. So the right of a government to regulate the internet, that platform as a public space, would be a challenge. On top of that, a company of that type will generally be an international company. So it will be a company that's operating in 50, 100, 150 different jurisdictions. So does each jurisdiction regulate its part in its own way? Is our users geo-blocked in order to stop accessing the French version because the laws are different than in the Serbian version? So practically, legally, jurisdictionally, it's very, very difficult to imagine. I would approach it from possibly the opposite perspective, and that is diligence on the part of governments. Governments are always asking these companies to regulate copyright, to regulate hate speech, terrorism, child protection, etc., etc. That regulation, that's pushing the private company into regulation of what is a public space, even if it's a public space that's privately run. And the question for governments is, you have ratified the European Convention on Human Rights. You see law, predictability, the principle of that restrictions must be based on law as cornerstones of your democratic society. What is your justification for pushing that responsibility into private, often foreign hands? What are you doing dismantling the cornerstones of our democratic system? And do you really see the benefits of doing that as being greater than the cost of doing it?
Thank you. One short question. There is an idea around Europe about special taxation of social media and platforms in order to transfer the value created on that side to the content providers, to media and industry which is losing business model. What do you think about that idea?
That idea was tried in Germany. It failed quite spectacularly. It was tried in Spain in a different way. It failed quite spectacularly. Now the European Commission has taken an idea which has failed very badly in 2 European countries and has proposed it as a European policy. And some clever person once said that the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This proposal is the very definition of insanity. The goals of the proposal aren't bad goals. Traditional media are struggling. But just because your motivations are pure does not mean that you're destined for success. So it hasn't worked, it won't work. Please don't do it.